Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Robinson, and I'm here today to talk to you about a program of research I've been involved in since about 2015, looking at domestic abuse perpetrators and what we can do to more systematically identify and prioritize those who should be in receipt of more targeted intervention by agencies. So what is the problem? Well, we know that domestic violence is a high volume crime. It creates considerable demand and resource issues for a variety of agencies. However, that demand is not evenly distributed, and some perpetrators are responsible for more frequent offending, more serious offending, more kind of harmful offending with more harmful consequences for victims. But that is concentrated in a subset of offenders. And Lawrence Sherman referred to this as the power few, the idea that a small minority of offenders will be responsible for the majority of the offending and the majority of the harm. So by concentrating our efforts on tackling the offending of those perpetrators, we'll be able to make a more significant impact in terms of reducing their offending, and increasing safety in the community. So it's about identifying those power few, those prolific serial offenders who are responsible for the most harm in the community and tackling those. So the key question, I'm getting warmed up, is how can we systematically identify priority perpetrators? How can we adequately coordinate existing services and interventions in order to significantly reduce their harmful behavior and hold them accountable for their offending? So rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, it is about identifying a subset and doing something with that particular group. In the US, crime prevention efforts which have focused on the power few have led to significant reductions in offending. There's examples from the states in terms of violence, homicide, and domestic violence. And these kind of focused deterrence approaches look to deter in a focused way those particular offenders that are responsible for the majority of the harm. And research in the UK also reinforces the importance of intensive multi-agency working on the highest risk domestic violence cases. Most notably, that would be the MERIC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conferences, which are multi-agency meetings to create safety plans around those victims designated to be at high risk of further harm or homicide. And MERICs have been in operation for some time, so the UK already has an approach which is about targeting resources on a subset of victims and concentrating efforts on those because they are at the highest risk of repeat victimization. So it's a parallel or similar model in terms of identifying those offenders who are responsible for the majority of the harm and targeting efforts, multi-agency efforts on their offender management. So the PPIT provides a way to identify this most harmful subset of perpetrators and therefore enable multi-agency partnership work to be focused around those perpetrators in particular. So the development of the PPIT took place in 2014 and was published in 2015. And this involved multi-agency focus group discussions around what are the characteristics of the perpetrators who are coming through the door repeatedly, the perpetrators who are creating highly harmful consequences for their victims, the characteristics of perpetrators from domestic homicide reviews. And so those focus group meetings with high-level practitioners from a range of agencies identified these 10 aspects that should be considered. And if those characteristics could be considered in a systematic way, it would help to identify and drill down on that subset of offenders that should be the focus of multi-agency risk management. So 5 characteristics of their offending profile. Is it active, i.e. recent? Is it escalating over time in seriousness? Is it repeated? So not just one-off. Is it serial? Are there more than one victim per perpetrator? Are there linked forms of offending, for example, child sexual abuse or elder abuse, or sexual assault, for example. Any other types of violence against women and girls would be considered. And then 5 characteristics of the offender, him or herself. For example, have they been previously referred to MAPA? Are they known to have contributed to a highly harmful consequence against one or more victims? This could be physical injury, but it also could be considered, psychological abuse that has dramatically limited the lifestyle or the daily activities of a victim. Are they known to have deteriorating mental health? Are they known to have substance misuse issues? And are they known to have used weapons in the past? And weapons is broadly defined to include the obvious, firearms or knives, but also have they used any implements in previous offending, which could be anything, a can of beans, rope, an iron, etc. So it's a broad definition of weapons. That's what the form looks like. You can see those 10 characteristics listed there. And then the practitioner uses the available information from their own agencies and liaising with partner agencies. So this is a behind the scenes second stage assessment. It's not an interview with a perpetrator. It's using agency information to try to prioritize responses to the power of few perpetrators. So they look to score 0 or 1, yes or no. Does this characteristic apply in the recent time frame within the past 6 months or ever? Is there known to be serial perpetration in their lifetime, and also is it recent? So in that way, you can start to look at the lifetime profile of a perpetrator, but also what's going on more recently. Obviously, a score of 20 would be the maximum, but it does then give a kind of indication of what's going on in the recent time period and how does that overlay in terms of what we know about the offender and their full offending history. And I think that's a difference or an innovation in terms of how other assessments of offenders have taken place, which are really focused much more on the current incident. So after the PIPIT was developed with input from practitioners, primarily from South Wales, we looked to test what it would mean to use the PIPIT in practice, not for live cases, but what we did was get agreement from the 4 police forces, 5 independent domestic violence services, and 19 probation units across Wales to use the PIPIT against historical cases within their caseloads and to score the PIPIT in that way. That would give us information about variations between agencies, how long it took, what are the challenges, should there be any refinements, were there any gaps or things that could be improved with the PIPIT. And that exercise was really informative. Not only did it show that when practitioners were asked to say, after they had scored PIPIT, is this a priority perpetrator? Is this someone who really does merit multi-agency monitoring, a kind of enhanced agency monitoring of their behavior and intervention, proactive intervention? So the red bars there are the kind of amount of perpetrators who scored those 10 characteristics who were designated priority perpetrators, and the gray bars were the presence of those characteristics for the ones that the practitioners felt were really not priority perpetrators. So you can see there that the PIPIT tool did help practitioners differentiate 2 groups, one of which has a very high profile of those, a really prevalent profile of those 10 characteristics, and another group where those characteristics were hardly present at all. And therefore, you could either say, well, they have all of those things going on, active, repeated, escalating offending, other types of violence against women and girls in their history or in their recent history. They've already been subject to MAPA before. One or more of their victims has had a highly harmful consequence from their offending behavior, et cetera, then those perpetrators are priorities for multi-agency risk management. And if conversely, you have what might be a group of people who are known to have offended, but really do not have those characteristics at nearly the same level, then those can be considered not priorities, Not that they're not important, but if you're prioritizing the use of resources, you have to make these kinds of judgments about which offenders should be the focus of your efforts. So the next stage of the research was to look at how the PIPIT could be incorporated into practice with live cases, not historic cases. And there is a kind of model of how it could work or how it has been working. So you have frontline agencies and practitioners recognizing that this person has committed a domestic abuse related offense. Using the PIPIT then helps to identify which of those perpetrators are priorities, and then the multi-agency management of them can take place using input and interventions and tactics from across the breadth of a multi-agency partnership, from police to also military police, probation, health, social workers. So in that way, it's a very similar model to the Merrick model, but instead of the victim being the unit of analysis or the focus of efforts, here it would be the priority perpetrators in receipt of that concerted multi-agency risk management. So in 2016 and 17, PIPIT pilots were implemented in 3 police force areas in England and Wales. And the results of that research are available in the final report you can see there. And that was a really interesting piece of research. It was a multi-method piece of research involving interviews with practitioners, also case file analysis. And I'll talk a bit about that now. So the 3 force areas were Hampshire, Dyfed-Powys, and Greater Manchester. And obviously these are very different forces geographically, population-wise, different considerations. Hampshire, there's a military presence there, there's a higher presence of weapons, and there's rurality, but also some small cities as well as ports. Dyfed-Powys, obviously a very large rural force with a relatively low rate of offending compared to, for example, Greater Manchester, which is an urban area and the second largest police force in England and Wales. So those were the research sites. They implemented their PIPIT projects in 2016 and 2017. You can see there that the scope differed across the forces. Hampshire, it was almost the entire county. Dyfed-Powys, it was force-wide. And in Greater Manchester, it was Oldham as the division that took on the PIPIT project. I just move this taskbar. So what Hampshire were aiming to do is multi-agency behavior change. They have a much higher level of service provision and NGO perpetrator interventions available, which they could bring into the intervention kind of portfolio for those priority perpetrators. Dyfed-Powys was more about identification and focus management. It's mainly a police and probation partnership. And Greater Manchester used kind of joint visits and trying to get perpetrators to engage with services that were available there. So, the rationale for change. Sorry, I'm floating around now. So we conducted interviews with practitioners working in the 3 sites. And, you know, like many things that are implemented off the back of practitioner expertise and understanding of frontline service provision, what's working, what's not, you know, they already knew that they were missing domestic abuse perpetrators. So this first one from Hampshire says, you know, hang on a second, why are we not monitoring these people? We're not ever doing anything about these perpetrators who are just going from victim to victim and appear to be getting away with it. So that's a kind of reflection on, you know, what can be seen from the Merrick approach, that victims are getting attention and multi-agency efforts to increase their safety, but the perpetrators can be somewhat invisible in that process. And so the aim was to be more proactive and more disruptive by identifying perpetrators that maybe slip through the net, and also identifying perpetrators that might have a domestic violence offending but were not known as domestic violence offenders. So using the PIPIT, they found that it was feasible and practical to use it in their in their daily work. Didn't take too long, 20 or 30 minutes, and it was getting all that knowledge and history about the offender. So you can kind of uncover their patterns of offending and how that might need to be managed. Bringing together information from different sources in one place. So intelligence and police data, information from domestic violence services, health, etc., being used to make an assessment about whether these are priority perpetrators or not. So you can see there the prevalence of, the prevalence of the items in the 3 sites, which shows some differences across the sites. For example, Deaf Powers is the red bar. You can see there are very high levels of mental health, deteriorating mental health amongst their priority perpetrators compared to Manchester and Hampshire. Like I said, Hampshire, much higher prevalence of weapons and weapon use in their cohort of priority perpetrators. And these link to types of interventions and knowledge that agencies have to have in order to intervene successfully. So the PPIT and multi-agency working, I think practitioners reflected very clearly that the PPIT enabled them to take a broader focus on perpetrators that were active in the community. They were able to focus their limited, relatively limited resources on putting measures in place to manage the risk that they posed and facilitate multi-agency working, because there is a more systematic approach rather than agencies working in silos with their own understanding of who should be, prioritized for intervention. It was starting to join the dots so that people knew and understood in a more collective multi-agency sense about who should be the focus for multi-agency work. The last quote there from Manchester saying, I think it's identified an avenue to get people who are not on the radar or who are on the radar but have not been charged at the moment. So looking at contacting children's social care or due Claire's Law's disclosure to a new partner. And so that kind of offenders who are active in the community, who are not necessarily just those on license being managed by probation. The idea that agencies are starting to understand who are those active offenders in the community who are priorities for risk management, but bringing together at a different level. So not waiting for someone to come onto a probation caseload, but being able to intervene much earlier based on that joined up and shared understanding of who's a priority perpetrator. So this table just shows the kinds of interventions that were available and utilized in the different sites. You can see there are kind of different profile of efforts and type of work. As I said, Hampshire has many more perpetrator interventions on offer, so they were able to refer perpetrators into particular programs in a way that Deaf Powers was not, and that Manchester was able, to a lesser extent. So overall, those PPIT projects showed benefits from, first of all, widening the multi-agency focus to include the perpetrator as well as the victim. So to complement what had already been going on around the merit process, to engender a more proactive and preventative approach rather than reactive approach, waiting for offenders to be convicted and on a probation caseload, for example, before anything can be done. Raising awareness of and better responses to psychological as well as physical harm. So I think the coercive controlling behavior and the recognition that high harm consequences were not limited to physical injury, but encompassed other kinds of outcomes that we see from coercive and controlling behavior was really important for raising practitioner awareness of who is really responsible for harm and producing harm in the community. And structuring professional judgment. So bringing together practitioners to agree on a simple checklist, but that checklist, if offenders are hitting all 10 of those, you have an insight into a situation where there needs to be more targeted and earlier intervention to manage the risk that they pose, because clearly they do pose a risk if they're a serial perpetrator, if they're prolific, if they're escalating, et cetera, et cetera. There is then a further piece of research looking at outcomes in deaf and POWIS following the PPIT pilot, and that research was important for showing a few key findings, one of which was the rate of reoffending of the priority perpetrators, and how much more reoffending they did. I mean, so in one way you can say that legitimizes the tool. The tool was identifying people who are at high rate of reoffending, and indeed they did reoffend. And primarily the finding there was that there was not enough knowledge of which interventions are suited for which perpetrators. There was a very underdeveloped landscape of service provision in terms of dedicated perpetrator programs. So they had a process in place for identifying perpetrators who they felt certain were priorities for risk management, but they had very little on offer other than what probation and police can routinely provide in order to deal with their offending behavior. And in deaf and POWIS, you might recall from this slide that very high levels of mental health needs and deteriorating mental health of perpetrators there. And so it really prompted that forest area to start to look at what could be implemented so that perpetrators are in receipt of some programs that the PPIT is highlighting that they need. A recent update from Hampshire is that they are currently working on a project called Project Foundation with Home Office funding. The force has set up 13 high harm capability teams, as they're known, and the PPIT is being used to assess the risk and need of this particular cohort of offenders who are younger, those that have children in the home, and those that are, have already designated their active offending through 2 or more offenses in the previous month. So it is really becoming business as usual in Hampshire in particular, as a forest area that has a lot of highly developed history and knowledge and provision of perpetrator programs there. So that report from Southampton University will be out in September 2022, which will be interesting to take a look at. And so finally, just to reiterate some of the key lessons from this program of research, and that, the PPIT enabled, like the DASH and for domestic abuse victims, really enables a kind of shared understanding amongst practitioners working in different agencies about who are the people that we should be focusing on within the context of a multi-agency partnership. The volume of domestic violence is too high to treat everyone the same, and not everyone needs the same kinds of approaches and interventions. That there needs to be some way of figuring out what people need so that they can become safer, and that they can, if they're victims, and that they can be also held accountable and rehabilitated if they are offenders. So we do need more evidence about which risk management tactics work best and for whom, even within that priority perpetrator cohort. Not everyone needs the same thing, and there needs to be further research to really unpack which intervention tactics are linked to successful outcomes for which perpetrators. So I think that's quite enough for today. I'll just thank you before closing for listening to this. All of the research I've mentioned is available online. It's also wrapped up in this article, which I published with Anna Clancy, who was a key collaborator in all of that research, and some of which was funded by the Crime and Security Institute at Cardiff University. Thank you very much. Bye.